Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to our July Brandwood Live webinar, where today I'll be talking about clinical data in China, and the webinar is entitled China Thinks Again on Foreign Clinical Data. A little bit about us before I begin. We're Brandwood Biomedical. We're a regulatory, quality and reimbursement consultancy in medical devices and diagnostics, operating across the Asia Pacific. We have our own offices in China and provide support for the full life cycle of regulatory affairs, including clinical trials. On your screen here, you'll see a photograph of the Peking Union Medical College Hospital, one of China's top 10 largest hospitals, an extraordinary place, and we're currently doing some trials in that hospital for some new diagnostics. But today is going to be about other ways of demonstrating clinical effectiveness apart from doing clinical trials. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what the current arrangements are in China, and then talk a bit about some recent policy proposals that have come out of the CFDA for consultation in a very rapid consultation cycle, announced in May, consultation closed in June, and review just what that might mean in terms of the requirements for clinical data going forward in China. So, as I said, there were recent announcements. Circulars 52 and 53, draft policy circulars, were announced, which proposed that China may look at foreign clinical data. They also proposed some other reforms to the clinical trial process to streamline ethics reviews, streamline the governance of trials. But the really interesting one was this proposal to accept foreign clinical data. It used to be the case that you could go into China with foreign clinical data, but all of that changed back in 2014 when Decree 650 was announced. Decree 650 in 2014 established a completely refreshed regulatory framework in China, and the big news then was that the possibility of using international clinical data to support regulatory filings in China was taken away, and there was a requirement that all Class 2 and Class 3 devices were required to have clinical trials conducted in China unless one of two things applied. Either a device was specifically exempted on a list of exempt devices published by the CFDA, or the manufacturer was able to obtain evidence for clinical equivalence by demonstration of equivalence of the device to a CFDA approved predicate. And we'll look a bit at that in detail in a moment. So just to give a flavor of the complexity of this, here are some, not all, some of the regulations which impact clinical trials in China. The CFDA continues to announce new orders, new policies, new subordinate regulations at what is sometimes a bewildering rate, and certainly there's a lot going on. We try and keep up with some of this, and we publish articles on our website, and these are just some of the recent publications around changes in China. But what is currently the situation? Before we look at the new draft policy proposals, let's take a look at what really goes on right now. So there are currently three paths for submitting clinical evidence in association with a medical device or IVD regulatory filing in China. Firstly, in the one on the left in green here, if your device is either Class 2 or 3, but it's in an exemption list, then you have to do two things. You have to actually explicitly document in the regulatory filing that your device matches the description of one of the devices in the exemption list. In other words, that you truly are an exempt device. And you still have to include a comparison to a substantially equivalent device that's already approved in China. So that still has to be done, although that comparison is very straightforward. And we'll look at that in a moment. Separately, if you're not in the exemption list, but you do have sufficient clinical evidence to make a comparison to a predicate device, then you can submit a clinical evaluation report. But that comparison has to be detailed, and we'll look at that in a moment. Thirdly, if you can't do either of the above, you're not in the exemption list, and you can't find a suitable predicate to which you can draw a comparison, then you're going to need to do a trial in China. Now, exemption lists, they have been published in a number of separate announcements, which are colloquially referred to as the waves of exemptions. So the first wave was published right on the heels of Decree 650, the original first wave exemption list, and that exempted 488 different Class 2 devices and 79 Class 3. And then there have been some follow-on additions to these exemption lists. In September last year, another 267 Class 2 and 92 Class 3s, and that included 15 IVDs amongst that set of exemptions. And then in May this year, 130 new IVDs were added, and then another small announcement of a further 22 Class 2 and 6 Class 3 devices. And if you do the numbers, that amounts to a total of 954 different device classes, categories, and 145 different IVDs are now exempt from clinical trials in China. So some examples of things that are exempt: a lot of simple disposable devices, hospital forceps, scissors, etc., ECG machines, some medical laser equipment, and being China, quite a bit of Chinese traditional medical equipment are all exempted from clinical trials. But those lists have now become quite large, and so there's quite a wide range. I'm not going to attempt to describe them all, but they include other things like conventional orthopedic fracture fixation plates, for example. Now, if you have an exempted device, you still have to do a comparison. One striking thing about China regulatory reform is that the China FDA is borrowing bits of practice from around the world that it sees as being the best. And one of the things they've done is they've borrowed the whole idea of predicate comparisons from the United States 510K model. And here it appears in the need to do a simple comparison of an exempt device to a listed and market device in China. And you can see that this table here looks a little bit like the comparison table you'd see in a typical 510K. You simply have to produce this relatively straightforward table, but base it on evidence held on file and added to the regulatory submission to support the table. Secondly, non-exempt devices. You can still do a predicate comparison. However, here it's a different story. Firstly, you have to meet three conditions. Firstly, the predicate needs to be the same class, needs to be the same intended use, and it must be approved in China for the same intended use, and there must be no significant technical differences between your device and your predicate device which have a negative impact on safety or performance. Again, that's a sort of similar sort of concept to what you see in the US 510K, but here's where it differs. If you're doing a 510K approval in the United States, you typically choose an approved predicate, which is very often a competitor device, and you would use public domain information to draw the comparisons. In China, when you submit the clinical evaluation report with the predicate comparison, you're going to need to do a lot more. Firstly, you've got to look at the basic principal operating mechanisms, the structural composition, materials, manufacturing processes. All of that stuff has to be compared in detail. You need to address every variance between your device and the predicate device, and show that there's nothing going to have a negative impact. And of course, I remind you, the predicate must be approved in China. But the evidence requirements that CFDA expects for this exercise are stringent. There's a table. There's a list of what's required. This is the list of all of the different things you have to compare, and the actual practice is that the level of comparisons are such that really you need access to the primary source data. Now, one approach, of course, is to go to your competitor and say, please, can I get access to your primary source data, because I need to make a comparison so I can bring my device to market in China and take your business away from you. Good luck with that, of course. Nobody's going to be able to get access to their competitor's data. So really, this pathway is only practical if you are making comparisons with a previous generation device which you marketed in China. In other words, if you've got a new version of your device, you can use your prior generation as the predicate and go forward and do a clinical evaluation report. In most other circumstances, it's going to be kind of difficult to get access to sufficient information to sustain the clinical evaluation report on related to a device that you don't own. There are some ways of doing it. For example, sometimes you'll find there's sufficient information available through freedom of information requests in other jurisdictions on competing devices, and use approaches like that. But anyway, that's the way it works at the moment. So the only feasible predicate, just to remind you, is an earlier variant of the new device for which the manufacturer holds primary testing and international clinical data for both devices. And don't forget that you need to do the rest of the clinical evaluation as well. So you need to evaluate the quality of literature. You need to look at data classification and analysis. When you're doing a literature review, you need to draw conclusions based on your analysis. And if you can't get sufficient evidence out of the literature, you may still need to turn back to a clinical study. So there's a full clinical evaluation report, not just the data on your device, but you need to look at the broader world outside, at what's in the clinical literature, what's in the post-market evidence in things like the regulator post-market databases, what's in your own customer feedback reports on similar devices, the whole thing, as you would see in clinical evaluation reports in other markets. But then you may still, if you can't do any of what I've just spoken about, need to do a clinical trial in China. And I'm not going to talk in depth about this today, but just to say that for some devices, there are actual China guidances. And here's an example. For coronary drug-eluting stents, there's a published CFDA guidance, which defines the study design that's expected, the sample sizes, how much follow-up, and what the evaluation criteria are. There are some specific requirements for those devices. If there aren't specific requirements for your devices, then the CFDA has expectations for what's done with clinical trials, and typically for a class 3 device, they would be looking to see 3 sites in China in different locations. For example, in vitro diagnostic trials, the CFDA expects for class 3 trials 3 sites and a minimum of 1,000 patient samples. It's a generic definition. It's not necessarily related to statistical power. In fact, the requirements for IVD trials in China are usually far greater than actually what's required in statistical terms. Your trial sizes will be more than enough in most cases to demonstrate the outcomes. But then in May this year, a bit of a glimmer of hope. CFDA has published draft policy documents in Circulars 52 and 53. And if implemented, these may have quite a dramatic effect on some devices and streamline the clinical evaluation process. So let's look at what they do. So firstly, Circular 53. Circular 53 seeks to modernize clinical trial practice and controls. Firstly, it proposes changing the ethics approval process to move to a lead site model. The idea being that one lead site, and when you do a multi-center study in China, you still have a lead site as you do in other jurisdictions, that the lead site will do the ethics review. You'll go to the institutional review board or ethics committee of the lead site and get an ethics approval from there. And that the secondary sites, usually at least 2 of them, will accept the lead site ethics review without a further review locally. Now that's not a radical proposal for those of you in other countries outside of China. It's certainly the process that we've moved to here in Australia. It's the process that's fairly widely used in the United States, for example, of the idea of having one lead ethics review and not duplicating the ethics review across each institution. It's going to be interesting to see how that works in China. Certainly, when it was implemented here in Australia, what happened, of course, was that the institutions then introduced other types of reviews so that each institution still had some control over what was going. So there wasn't necessarily a complete centralization of the ethics review. But that is similar to international practice. Secondly, the CFDA is proposing abolition of the certification of clinical study sites. The current process in China is that clinical trials are expected to be done at sites that are designated as approved clinical trial sites. Now, there is a list of designated sites. The regulation says that for medicines and medical devices, you must conduct trials in sites that are approved for the particular clinical specialty that applies to your device. The challenge is that there's never been a medical device trial site list published, and so the ad hoc practice has been to refer to the pharmaceutical approved trial list. So, for example, if you're doing trials for oncology diagnostics, you need to go to hospitals that are on the oncology list for pharmaceuticals. There is some flexibility around that, but that's been the practice. CFDA is proposing to move away from that and say, look, we're going to get out of the business of designating individual sites in advance. What they're proposing to do is to replace the current designation list with some objective criteria for what a suitable clinical trial site should look like, and that the site simply notifies that it is conducting trials. So there's going to be replaced with a notification process to CFDA. You say, I'm doing this trial, and here's the site, and here's why it meets your objective criteria. So that needs to be done. That's what's being proposed. How it will work out in practice is yet to be seen, but it does seem to be a reasonably straightforward approach. Thirdly, CFDA is proposing to increase on-site audits of clinical trials. In fact, the practice is that that's already taking place. The issue there is that you fail a clinical trial audit and you lose the registration application that's supported by that clinical trial. And we've seen that recently in some fairly high-profile IVD applications from well-known international companies who have failed the CFDA registration because of breaches of protocol in the clinical trial, and sometimes quite small breaches. So be aware, if you're going to end up conducting a clinical trial in China, you will be audited. The audit actually takes place by the local CFDA, by the provincial or city CFDA, which has control over the lead clinical site. So if you're doing a trial where your lead site is at Peking Union Medical College Hospital, the one I showed the photograph of, then expect to be audited by the Beijing FDA. Those of you who are not familiar with how it works in China, there's not just the national FDA, but there is the provincial FDA, and in some of the larger cities, a city FDA. And the Beijing FDA will audit clinical trials carried out in Beijing for compliance to the good clinical practice regulations. And if they fail the audit, if they write it up for breaches of protocol, which are significant, then you may find that the CFDA, when reviewing the regulatory submission, will reject the submission because of the clinical trial not being compliant with GCP. Then Circular 53 was the second one. Circular 53 proposed acceptance of international data. It proposed that CFDA can use, instead of in China clinical trial data, that CFDA could accept international data, but data which have been used to support regulatory approvals outside of China. So it's not just any data. These data must have been through a regulatory review somewhere else. So something that's been used to submit to the United States FDA, for example, or a CE marking approval. The trial must pass an on-site CFDA audit, and the data must be applicable to Chinese population in terms of demographics and ethnicity and clinical practice. Now that last one is not an unusual requirement. The requirement to show that your clinical trial data are applicable to local populations, local clinical practice is routinely applied by the United States Food and Drug Administration, for example. And those of you who dealt with the FDA and done clinical studies know that you almost always end up having to do at least one center of your study must be in the US, and usually two. So this is not a uniquely Chinese requirement. But the issue of the data that you bring to China must have been through a US or other regulatory approval and must be a local audit could be challenging. Yet to see how this is going to work out in practice, but we'll see. And then the other part of Circular 52 was that post-market clinical trials may be countenance for novel devices which address unmet clinical need. In other words, the practice would be that you would achieve a conditional registration for one of these devices without the full clinical data. Then you would be expected to do a post-market trial and to bring forward the post-market data on completion to then convert your conditional registration to a full registration on the basis of course, satisfactory outcome from the clinical trial. So the interesting thing is this going to impact on the expedited review pathways? So will this approach of introducing post-market clinical trials be an option for devices which are eligible for priority review or for the innovative device channel, the so-called green channel? That remains to be seen. And the question is, how is this all going to work in practice? So firstly, how do you demonstrate equivalence of ethnic, demographic and clinical practice for international sites? It's not a uniquely China issue, and the approach that's been taken in the past by CFDA is really about how many ethnic Chinese patients you have in your study population. And that's pretty difficult to do. We're seeing the same sort of thing in other Asian jurisdictions, and we're seeing some Asian jurisdictions having similar requirements, although, for example, the Japanese PMDA will accept trial data from other parts of East Asia, so they'll accept data from Korea, for example. But at the moment, what China is saying is they're going to stick with their existing practice that you're going to need to show that there is equivalence between your trial site and China. Now, of course, you may be able to say, well, for a particular condition, there is no difference between different ethnicities. It can be as simple as, for example, in orthopedic devices, you need to make sure that you've got smaller ranges in the study, smaller size ranges, simply because the differences in stature between the Chinese population and the Western population. Or it may be more complicated when you're dealing with something like a companion diagnostic for a medicine which relates to a particular gene expression, where you will see ethnic differences between the populations, and then you're going to need to bring actual Chinese data. It really will depend on the individual circumstance. Will this facilitate a Chinese arm of an international multi-center study? That's an interesting thought, because the idea of accepting international data but having a certain proportion of Chinese data may open the door to international multi-center studies being used to support CFDA regulatory approvals where one or more of the arms are in China and there are others overseas. Yet to see whether that'll be possible. How do you demonstrate that the data have been used to support an international regulatory filing? Does that mean you're going to have to share your US FDA file documents with the CFDA? Some people will be quite happy to do that, others maybe not so much, but that remains to be seen. And what about historical data? So the CFDA have said they can accept these international data, but they will want to do an on-site audit of the trial. But what if your overseas trial has already been closed off and done? In fact, it will have done because it's been used to support an international regulatory filing. So how is this done post hoc? How is it done after the event of the trial? Will CFDA still want to go and audit the clinical trial files after the event, or is this really a mechanism for doing a parallel CFDA clinical trial at the same time as you're doing one for another market. Again, it remains to be seen how that works out. So that's as much as I want to say today. It's clearly an interesting time, as they say. The pendulum is looking like it's starting to swing backwards. We're seeing the door being cracked open a little bit to the acceptance of international clinical trial data, which was the common practice just 3 years ago, until Decree 650 closed off that pathway and required everybody to start doing clinical trials in China. This may be the first step, and at the rate that CFDA continues to announce modifications and fine-tuning of its regulatory framework, who knows what's going to happen next, but it's an interesting thing to watch, so do watch this space. I'll finish by saying a plug for the China International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. The CIMDR is probably now the world's largest medical device regulatory conference. It's run by the CFDA, by the China Center for Food and Drug International Exchange, which is a division of the CFDA. It's a very large, very well-run conference, and I'm delighted that I'll be there again this year and have been invited to provide a presentation at the plenary, and also at the Biological Evaluation Forum. There's a whole program of technical sub-forums at this 3-day meeting, which have in-depth exploration of particular aspects of regulation. This year it's in Hangzhou, as you can see, on the 15th and 18th of August. Down below are a couple of photographs from previous CFDAs. On the left, the group of international experts from the ISO panel that writes ISO 10993 participated in the biocompatibility subforum. This photograph was taken 2 years ago. We went again last year, and that's been a very successful event, where it's the only place in the world where that group meets in a public forum of that nature every year and presents on the latest development in biocompatibility. So if you're interested in biocompatibility, come to China. And here on the right is the director of CFDA setting out the policy platform, doing a review of what's happened and where they're going over the next few years. And that there's usually a presentation like that every year. So if you really want to see what the agency's thinking and where they're going next, you'll get it straight from the directors of the agency. And last year, for example, they talked about specifically clinical trials and the challenges in China about the integrity of clinical data, and how the agency was cracking down really hard and doing a lot of audits and providing the option for manufacturers to withdraw clinical trial data if the manufacturer was aware there were problems with it. So in other words, an amnesty was declared: pull your data now and walk away, and we'll not do anything about it. But if we find out that there's a problem later, then expect to experience the full force of the law in China. And several thousand clinical studies were withdrawn and registrations were cancelled when that amnesty was announced. Anyway, it's going to be an interesting meeting. It's in just a few weeks' time, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you. That's as much as I wanted to say this morning. If you've enjoyed this webinar, I'll just point out that you can follow what's coming next via our website, where we announce all our webinars and we provide recordings of past webinars. Follow me on Twitter, look at our LinkedIn page, and we also put much of this material on YouTube. Those of you who've registered for this webinar will receive an email afterwards, and we've recorded this presentation and we'll send you a copy of the slides. And we'll also send you, on this occasion, an English language translation of the China Clinical Evaluation Guidance, just for your information. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next Brandwood Live webinar.